Vaishnavamshta Shirupam Sagajatam Sagana Ragadantam Vidam Tam Jivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Purijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Shivashakan Vidamshta He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Banu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhi Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamamani Hare Pri Vanchakapatubhyashta Kripasundabhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Putale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swamini Namane Namo Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prishtaya Putale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swamini Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Prasharne Nirvishesha Shunavari Pashchatyate Shitarne. So there's a very long purport. I'll try my best to cover it all. And so from the verse, we understand that the Srimad Bhagavatam is the expanded version or the natural commentary upon the Vedanta Sutra. And there's obviously is Srila Prabhupada, he will often reiterate the point or explain that point that just like you can examine the first Atta Brahma Jigyasa, Jamadhyasya, and then in the Bhagavatam the same thing is explained. Jamadhyasya yato nivayat itarata chartis abhigyasvarat, etc. So too, this verse from the Vedanta Sutra, Anandamayo Bhyasat, is being explained here. The living entity is naturally, he's naturally full of bliss. He's naturally blissful. That's where it comes in the Sanskrit itself. And it's this bliss is, this complete bliss and satisfaction comes about when he associates with the Supreme Personality of God, when he reattains that position. The same thing that is explained in the Vedanta Sutra and codes or sutras is explained here in the Bhagavatam in a more expanded form, and particularly with this purport, Srila Prabhupada, our acharyas, and particularly Srila Prabhupada, has expanded it even more. Not that it's being added to, or not that it's a interpretation of it. Some people, I was just being asked this recently, it's what Srila Prabhupada is presenting here in his books, what Vyasadeva has presented in the Bhagavatam, and our acharyas present, etc., is not necessarily an interpretation or something of that nature because they're not changing anything. What it is likened to, as Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it's akin to fluffing out cotton in a pillow. The same material is already there in the Vedanta Sutra. It has been fluffed out by Vyasadeva. So similarly to that which was given by Vyasadeva is again being fluffed out again by the representative of Vyasadeva, Srila Prabhupada. And so the same thing is going on in the Guru and Parampara. So this is being presented here in this verse. So immediately, so there's an explanation in this very elaborate purport. Srila Prabhupada, he says that he makes a distinction between those aspiring to merge into the impersonal prominent effulgence and the Bhagavatas, who reject such forms of liberation. And there's a description here. They always aspire after the personal association with the Lord in one of the Vaikuntha spiritual planets. And he says, the whole of the spiritual sky, of which the total number of material skies is only an insignificant part, is full of unlimited numbers of Vaikuntha planets. So this Vaikuntha, this spiritual world, is described through what comes here. There's some short description in the second canto, a little bit, is elaborately explained, coming later in the Bhagavatam, and in other Shastras as well, just as Brahma Samhita, specifically of Goloka Vrindavan, Chintamari Prakara Sadhamashukalpa Vriksha, Lakshavriteshu Siddhabhira Abhipaliyanta. We chant every day that the Supreme Personality of God is residing within his own spiritual abode, which is bedecked with wish-fulfilling gems, and is being served by thousands upon thousands of goddesses of fortune. And this is in the third canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So this can apply to Goloka Vrindavan, as it's generally taken by our acharyas. In the third canto, in the description of Vaikuntha, Srila Prabhupada, he I don't want to jump ahead of myself, but in the Vaikuntha, there is the devotees, Srila Prabhupada mentioned this later in the purport, but the devotees share the same form of the Lord. Every woman, every man in Vaikuntha possesses a four-armed form just as Narayan does. He looks just like Narayan, but it's said there the difference is that Narayan can be distinguished because he has the mark of Srivatsa on his chest. And so also all the women in the Vaikuntha lokas, they resemble the goddesses of fortune. And so this verse that the Lord is being served by thousands and thousands of goddesses of fortune, Srila Prabhupada comments at the third canto, this means that all those women in the Vaikuntha loka, this is what it is being referred to. As well, I can refer to the unlimited amount of gopis in Goloka Vrindavan. So the spiritual world or the material world is just an insignificant part of the whole existence, you could say. Srila Prabhupada is saying here, of the whole spiritual sky. So in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Lord Chaitanya explains to Sanatana Goswami very elaborately how this material world is just something like a dark little cloud, and the whole sky, the whole Paramvyoma, the whole spiritual sky. This material creation is, in the Vedas as well, the same thing comes. There's what's called ekapad and tripad bhutam. That the spiritual existence, Vaikuntha Loka, the whole spiritual sky, it takes up 3/4 of the whole manifestation, for lack of a better existence. Whereas the material sky, the material creation, only occupies only a fourth of it. And so we can understand that this explanation here, there are unlimited numbers of pure devotees. The Lord enjoys himself in the association of unlimited numbers of pure devotees. There's much more devotees and living entities in general residing within the spiritual sky than are even manifest in this material world. And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, when talking with Vasudev Datta, Vasudev Datta was, anyway, it's a long story, but Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was making the point that even if all the living entities within this universe were liberated immediately, there are so many living entities within the material world that immediately the whole universe will again be repopulated. So we can just imagine, or we can imagine, the number of devotees residing in the spiritual sky, the breadth and the amount of variegated activities that are going on there. So the spiritual sky, Srila Prabhupada writes here that, so the destination of the Bhagavata is to enter into one of the Vaikuntha planets, and each of which the personality of God, in his unlimited personal expansions, enjoys himself in the association of unlimited numbers of pure devotees. So there's a nice verse that comes later in the second canto, before Shukadeva Goswami, he recites, it's his Mangalacharanam to the Bhagavatam, his prayers that he recites. He says, Namo namaste istu Rishabhaya Sattvatam, Vidura Kashtaya Mohoka Yoginam, Nirasta Samyatisha Yena Radhasa, Svadhamani Pramani Ramsati Namaha. So he says, let me offer my respectful obeisances unto him who is the associate of the members of the Yadu dynasty, and who is always a problem for the non-devotees. He is the supreme enjoyer of both the material and spiritual worlds, yet he enjoys his own abode in the spiritual sky. There is no one equal to him because his transcendental opulence is immeasurable. So the Lord is the supreme enjoyer of both the material manifestation and specifically of the spiritual manifestation. The conditioned living entities enjoy or tries to enjoy himself within the material sphere. But this enjoyment is just a perverse reflection of the real enjoyment that is going on in Goloka Vrindavan, in the Vaikuntha worlds. The real enjoyer is Krishna himself, is Narayan, is the Supreme Personality of God. And he enjoys to a degree that we can't even fathom. And it's his mercy upon us that by rendering service to him, we can also share in his enjoyment. Now, I'll get to that point later. But this enjoyment that takes place in the spiritual world, it's so vastly different or so vastly superior than that which is offered in the material world. Srila Rupa Goswami, in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he says that even if you take the happiness, so these impersonalists that Srila Prabhupada is describing here, they aspire to merge into the Brahman effulgence because they know that from there in the effulgence there's cessation of all material misery. There's attainment of real peace, shanta, and there is feelings of bliss, such chit ananda. So there's this experience in the Brahmajyoti, and it's undeniable certainly, but Srila Rupa Goswami, he says that even if you take the concentrated bliss of that one derives in Brahman, it is likened to a small drop when compared to the ocean of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the ocean of the nectarian ocean of devotional service. The happiness that resides, that's there in the spiritual world, is so many, many, unlimited millions of times greater than anything we can do, than even the happiness of Brahman. What to speak of happiness within the material world? So just two, it's described also in the third canto, if I'm not wrong, that the residents of Vaikuntha Loka, they're so naturally blissful and so naturally absorbed in service to Krishna and service to Narayan that they completely forget any idea of sex life. They have not that they don't necessarily have access to it, but it's just that it's likened to like a fig. The happiness of sex life is likened to a fig in comparison to the bliss of devotional service they already have. And who's that saying? Is it either Yamunacharya, he says one, or Bivala Mangala Thakur, he also says that. Yamunacharya, at least, he says this, that now that I've been engaged in the service of Lord Krishna, I'm forgetting all pleasures. When I think of sex life, my lips curl at the thought, and I spit at the thought. So what was once, and Yamunacharya was previously a great king. He had so many, and naturally the Kshatriya class, the kings, have so much access to, sex life, etc. And traditionally they would have so many lives, but he gave all of that up for the service of the Lord. So the spiritual abode is completely full. It's Anandamayu rasa pratibhavitabis. It's full of this Anandamayu rasa. This nectarian mellow is the devotional service. And this abode is further described in different places in the Upanishads as well as the Bhagavad Gita. One famous verse, Srila Prabhupada would often quote, Na tad bhasyate suryo na shashanko na pavakaha yadgatva na nivartante tadhama paramam mama. That my supreme abode, it is self-illuminated. It has no need of illumination by artificial lights such as the sun, such as the moon, fire, electricity, etc. like this. Srila Prabhupada makes the point that naturally this material world is full of darkness. Naturally, you need external illumination from the material world. Matter by the material energy by nature is darkness, but it derives light. The light that is manifest in this material world all comes from the spiritual world. Specifically, explain the Brahmajyoti. The light of the Brahmajyoti permeates through this world, and it's therefore all the light in this world, from the sun to even these electrical lights we see now, to fire, it's all a transformation or some sort, has its source in this spiritual light. So this real, whereas the material world is constantly in darkness, whereas we need external objects to illuminate during the night, whereas the nature of the material world is to be dark, the nature of the spiritual world is to always be in light, always to be in knowledge. And the material world is dark because, but in terms of light, but also in terms of knowledge. Everybody in the material world, the coverings in the material world are by nature, it plunges one into ignorance. Whereas in the spiritual world, one is naturally full of knowledge. One naturally has knowledge of his constitutional position and the absolute reality, the personality of God, in one form or another, existing within different rasas. So, Srila Prabhupada, to continue this point, Srila Prabhupada is making the point of the impersonalists and the Bhagavatas. So, he makes a lot of points here. I'll just try to condense them down. So he says briefly, the Bhagavatas desire to enter into one of the Vaikuntha planets, in each of which the personality of God in his unlimited personal expansions enjoys himself, etc. And the impersonalists who aspire to merge in the impersonal Brahmajyoti effulgence of the Supreme Lord, but have no conception of loving devotional service to him in his personal form and the spiritual manifestation, may be compared to certain species of fish. So the devotee, well, actually, to hit on this example, so this, again, this same example, Srila Prabhupada is elaborating more. The impersonalist, and if you hear, even among New Age pseudo-spiritualists, this example is common, that all rivers flow into the great ocean, everything merges into one, all that all paths lead to the same goal. Srila Rupa Goswami and his Mangalacharanam to the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, he gives this verse, Srila Prabhupada in his Nectar Devotion, he's translated it there. He says that to paraphrase, the impersonalists, they say their goal is they're like small fish swimming at the top of the ocean, having come for the rivers and rivulets. And Srila Prabhupada explains here that they, being by nature, products of rivers and rivulets, inevitably they return to those rivers to propagate, to more or less enjoy sense gratification, in other words, metaphorically. But the devotees are likened to sharks and whales and timingala fish, etc., within the deep ocean of devotional service. In other words, the devotees, they can remain deep within the ocean, and they can properly, it's their natural habitat, and they can relish the nectar of devotional service. Whereas the impersonalists, they only glide on the top of the Brahman effulgence, the impersonal Brahman effulgence, and they can't enter into the deeper levels of spiritual reality. And inevitably, we understand that yene ravanakshi vimuktamanayastvayasta bhavad avishudapurya aruhya krishna parampatam tataf patanti yadu naturityashmarangriha. That the impersonalists, they again fall down, they leave that river, they leave that ocean, being unable to stay there, and they fall down for their position of spiritual elevation because they neglect the lotus feet of the Lord. Whereas the devotees always relish the nectar of the lotus feet of the Lord. So that's that example. Now, this point, Srila Prabhupada, he hits on these devotees, they never come back to this material world. So yes, that's their, I'm just forgetting the verse. Punarjanma navedyate. We don't, the pure devotee, he doesn't take birth again in this material world. But specifically, a very important point mentioned here is the bhakti yogi, being completely engaged in the Lord's service, has no attraction for any other process of liberation like jnana or yoga. A pure devotee is a 100% is a 100% devotee of the Lord and nothing else. A pure devotee is not a devotee of his wife, his family, his kids, of the state, of this, of that, of jnana, of yoga, or of liberation. Whereas like everybody else within this material world are striving after, a devotee specifically rejects all forms of a liberation for his own sense enjoyment. Lord Kapila Dev, he says to his mother Devotee, Salokya sarsti samipya sarupya katvam apiyuta diyamanam nagrinanti vinamat sevanam janaha. That among the 5 sorts of liberation, Salokya sarsti samipya sarupya and ekatvam, a devotee rejects all, specifically ekatva, kaivalya liberation. A devotee never accepts, and Srila Prabhupada makes the point in this purport, that the liberation of the impersonalist, a devotee never entertains the thought, because he knows there's liberations that are much higher, and he knows that to accept sort of liberation is, for a devotee, it's hellish actually. It's a hellish state of life, because it would render him devoid of the devotional service of the Lord. But even then, these other forms of liberation, salokya sarsti samipya sarupya, still a devotee doesn't accept them. Diyamanam nagrinanti vinamat sevanam janaha. A devotee doesn't accept them if the devotional service to the Lord isn't included with it. If it doesn't enhance a devotee's devotional service, a devotee won't even accept liberations of residing on the same planet of the Lord, accepting a similar form, a form the same as the Lord's, etc., like this. Because the devotee, as Srila Prabhupada says here, is a 100% devotee of the Lord and nothing else. He's not striving for any sort of liberation, but the Lord may automatically give the devotee liberation to perfect or to enhance his service. Naturally, within the material world, just practically speaking, the material body, it only has so much, it's temporary, and naturally exhausts itself. And it reaches a point, just like an old garment, at one point we have to discard it and throw it off. So similarly, the material body, for some time, is conducive to our service to Lord Krishna, but there comes a point in our maturity of devotional service where it becomes an impediment, where the bodily miseries, they take over so much, and we may be so incapacitated bodily that the material body becomes an inhibition for us, or even more than that, there may be an opportunity where we can render better service to the Lord by accepting a spiritual body, and the Lord may offer it like that. So such things occur. So within the purport to this verse in the third canto, Lord Kapila speaking, Srila Prabhupada gives this purport. I'll just read from. He says that it is clearly stated here that a pure devotee does not desire ekattva, oneness with the Supreme Lord, as desired by impersonalists and the mental speculators and the meditators. To become one with the Supreme Lord is beyond the dream even of a pure devotee. Sometimes he may accept promotion to the Vaikuntha planets to serve the Lord there, but he will never accept merging into the prominent effulgence, which he considers worse than hellish. Such ekattva, or merging into the effulgence of the Supreme Lord, is called kaivalya. But the happiness derived from kaivalya is considered by the pure devotee to be hellish. The devotee is so fond of rendering service to the Supreme Lord that the 5 kinds of liberation are not important to him. If one is engaged in pure transcendental loving service to the Lord, it is understood that he has already achieved the 5 kinds of liberation. I think I believe it's Bevala Mangala Thakur. He says, he has one famous verse where he says that all mystic powers, liberation personified comes to the pure devotee as his maidservant and serves him in that way. So a devotee naturally has access to all sorts of liberation. So Srila Prabhupada, he continues that when a devotee is promoted to the spiritual world, Vaikuntha, he receives 4 kinds of facilities. This is in the third canto, I'm sorry. One of these is Salukya, living on the same planet as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In Sarshti, liberation, the opulence of the devotee, is equal to the opulence of the Supreme Lord. Samipya means to be a personal associate of the Supreme Lord. In Sarupya liberation, the bodily features of the devotee are exactly like those of the Supreme Person, but for 2 or 3 symptoms found exclusively on the transcendental body of the Lord. And he gave the example for the Srivatsa mark, for example, distinguishes Narayan from all the other devotees in Vaikuntha. So a devotee, so this point that a devotee is 100% a devotee of the Lord. He's not a devotee of his own mind, his own senses, or any sort of liberation. And so I was making this point that in the spiritual world is naturally full of bliss. And the real enjoyer is a basic point, but the actual enjoyer is Lord Krishna himself. He is the enjoyer of all material worlds and of the spiritual worlds. And by his enjoyment, naturally too, we can also relish in enjoyment. But it's not that we execute devotional service to taste that enjoyment. That enjoyment is either naturally supplied by the Lord, and in some cases it's forced upon the devotee by the Lord. Sometimes it's seen that a devotee naturally it's seen actually, that a devotee will neglect his own welfare for the service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And to this point, and we see in the case of the highest topmost devotees, that they'll even, it comes at the end of Chaitanya Charitamrita, that Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he says that even if, to condense it, even if I am somebody's enemy, somebody is my enemy, but they render service to Krishna much better than I can, then it is my happiness to go and serve that devotee. Because a devotee's real intent lies with Krishna's happiness. A devotee's real purpose lies in seeing that Krishna is made happy. And if Krishna is made happy by somebody who a devotee may not be friendly with or maybe an enemy of, a real devotee is happy to see that person making Krishna happy. That's the end goal. So, whereas Srila Prabhupada, he gives one purport in the Shikshashtakam prayers of the chapter of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. He says that this is the grade of real pure devotional service. Whereas all other forms that are adulterated mixed with, of course, karma, jnana, yoga, etc., like this, but even forms, just like I was saying, so the Lord is the supreme enjoyer, and we can share in that enjoyment. So naturally, that may be there, but if our goal in devotional service is also to share if our goal in devotional service is to share in Krishna's enjoyment, then that is not pure devotional service. Srila Prabhupada, he says that's the goal of the Prakrita Sahajiyas. And you can see traditionally that was the case. Presumably, I'm presuming Srila Prabhupada is quoting from Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's commentary on the Chaitanya Charitamrita. So that was the case in the time of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta. That was the case in the time of Srila Prabhupada. And that's the case exactly same today. If you see the Prakrita Sahajiyas who are existing today, the same thing is going on, that they make a show, again paraphrasing of Srila Prabhupada's purport, they make a show of devotional service, and they may advertise themselves as being very elevated, or they may hint, may not directly say, and they may speak on a very high platform and speak on it, and show themselves to be relishing a very high grade of devotional service, but really, even though they may be doing some sort of devotional service, their goal is to share in the happiness with Krishna. Their goal is ultimately to derive their own sense gratification from devotional service in one form or another, whether it be under different headings, but the goal is the same. So we shouldn't be devotees like this. We should be devotees following in the example of our previous acharyas. Srila Prabhupada, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakur, Srila Gaurkishore Das Babaji, etc. And Prahlad Maharaj, who famously prayed when Lord Nrsimhadev offered him a benediction, he said, Yadi dasyasi me kaman varams tvam varatarshapa kamanam hriya samroham bhavatas tu vrine varam. O my Lord, best of the givers of benediction. The Lord can give any benediction we so desire. Lord Nrsimhadev, he was ready to give Prahlad anything he desired. In fact, Prahlad Maharaj, he rejected any sort of benediction offered by Nrsimhadev. But Nrsimhadev was very insistent. So Prahlad Maharaj replied, if you at all want to bestow a desirable benediction upon me, then I pray from your lordship that within the core of my heart there be no material desires. So we should follow in the example of Prahlad Maharaj. And this mood of simply striving for the service of the Lord and simultaneously hand in hand giving up all material desires. And by doing so, then we'll actually relish the nectar of devotional service. When we render service to Krishna without any sort of his basic philosophy, Savaipum Samparo Dharmo Yito Bhakti Adokshaji, Ahetuki Pratiyata Yadatma Suprasiditi, that we become satisfied when we render service which is without cause and uninterrupted, but we must do it practically. We must have no other motivation in pure devotional service, whether it be for our own bodily health, the welfare of our family, for the welfare, for the care of our husband or of our wife or of our family, kids, etc., for our own personal well-being, or even to be placed within a pleasant situation in devotional service. Sometimes the nature is such that within devotional service, sometimes we're in a very pleasant situation. Sometimes we're in a very unpleasant situation. Sometimes the spiritual master gives us an order, and it's very easy to execute. And sometimes he gives us an order which is very difficult to execute. It was very difficult to execute for Shivananda Prabhu, Gurudas Prabhu, etc., Mukunda Prabhu. It was very difficult for them to cross the ocean and go to London and live in a foreign country. They spoke the language, but the country was foreign. They had nowhere to stay. They were living on the streets, and finally they got a place. And they were living in some abandoned warehouse for almost a year, more or less. It wasn't easy for them to do that. But the result of which, it was Srila Prabhupada's and Srila Prabhupada's own spiritual master. It was their very strong desire. And by executing that order, we see the result of that. By famously, and Shyamasundar Prabhu as well, there's others, the Madhajis as well, Yamuna Madhaji, etc., like that. But by accepting those austerities, Yamuna Madhaji and Gurudas Prabhu, they had actually a kid at the time, and they were practically living on the streets of London with their child. But the result of that is the Krishna consciousness movement exploded in London, throughout the whole United Kingdom. They met by chance, Shyamasundar Prabhu's very strong desire, you could say. They met George Harrison, which then helped the Hare Krishna movement so much in terms of publishing Radha Krishna Temple, that album, by publishing the Krishna book. And if you observe historically, After 1970, after those devotees kickstarted the movement in England, as well as there's other factors, but the movement began to explode specifically with that album. So it was the order of the spiritual master, and it was very difficult to execute, but nonetheless, they maintained their enthusiasm to do so. And by executing that order, they've immensely contributed to the mission of Lord Chaitanya and pleased Srila Prabhupada on an unimaginable scale, as well as the previous acharyas. What was impossible for some of the topmost sannyasis of the Gaudiya Mat to accomplish, a few Grahastha devotees of the West, who were only devotees for a couple of years, managed to accomplish by dint of faith in the order of the spiritual master. Similarly, too, there's so many things there. Famously, we often give the example, Srila Prabhupada, he was riding in the train with one Western devotee in India, and he ordered him to get off this train and start a center at the local place. That's not an easy order from the spiritual master. There's so many difficult orders the spiritual master may give us. There's so many difficult things that Lord Krishna, the Guru and Parampara, and the spiritual master may tell us. And there are many hellish situations of life that we may be in a very pleasant situation in life. We may be in a very hellish situation of life. But that shouldn't matter for a pure devotee. That doesn't matter. And we should try our best to follow in those footsteps. If you examine, there's so many cases actually. Devotees, just in my mind, of Srila Prabhupada's time, who were, with the desire to execute the spiritual master, were undergoing so many difficult austerities. Tejas Prabhu in Delhi, he will go out daily with no concern for their own self-regard. He would go out daily to meet life members, and they were so poor at the time, they couldn't afford proper prasadam. He couldn't afford proper even footwear. His feet were bleeding, but he never gave up the order of his spiritual master. He always kept in mind the pleasure of his spiritual master and the pleasure of Lord Krishna. And we see the result of that. Practically, from that life membership program, it helped the Krishna consciousness movement so much. And practically all the preaching in India up until just recently was based more or less, not all the preaching, but a very significant chunk of the preaching was due to this life membership program, the success of it. So, all due to faith in the order of the spiritual master, and with the intent behind all of this, the intent only to render service to Lord Krishna without any other motive. Anya bilashita shunyam gyana karmadyanavritam anukuliyana krishnanu shilanam bhaktir uttama. That we desire to render, our only desire should be to render uttama bhakti, the highest form of devotional service to the Lord. When we offer anything to Krishna, naturally we want to make it very nice. Naturally, whenever we cook something for Krishna, we want it to be the nicest thing. When we decorate the altar for Krishna, we want Krishna to look the most beautiful he's ever looked. When we buy something for Krishna, some arty paraphernalia, some plate, we want to look for the best. When we distribute books for Krishna, we want to offer Krishna we want to distribute so many books for Krishna. We want to distribute the biggest books for Krishna. We want to do the best for Krishna. So naturally, it should be our intent and motive to offer uttama bhakti unto the Lord. The best thing we can possibly offer to our spiritual master, unto the Lord Krishna, is to simply engage in uttama bhakti, the highest form of devotional service, without any sort of other ulterior motive. And the result is this. Srila Prabhupada continues here that we should further note in this verse that the two words shantam and anandam, which denote the devotional service of the Lord, can really bestow upon the devotee two important benedictions, namely peace and satisfaction. So, to summarize some more sentences by Srila Prabhupada, he says that the impersonalists, they naturally strive after these things. The impersonalists is, as I previously said, they're seeking after this happiness of Brahman, which supplies them peace, shantam, and anandam, bliss. But a devotee, he doesn't necessarily aspire up to these things, but still yet he attains these things without any sort of endeavor. Bhoktaram yagatapasam sarva lokam maheshwaram suridam sarva bhutanyam gyatva mam shantim richati. Simply by knowing Krishna as the supreme enjoyer and trying to facilitate Krishna's enjoyment, naturally a devotee becomes peaceful. It is natural opulence of a devotee. There's one verse as well by the Kapila Dev in the third canto. Tidikshava karunika surida sarvadehinam ajata shastrava shantan sadhava sadhabhushanaha. That the natural ornament or the natural quality of a sadhu, of a devotee, a saintly person, there are many mentioned there, but he's naturally peaceful. He naturally abides by the regulations of the Shastras, and by doing so, he's naturally peaceful. Even more. A devotee naturally attains this, or rather, the Lord naturally gives the devotee peace in devotional service. And this peace isn't necessarily a form of, it's not a bodily symptom. It's a spiritual. Piece of life. We may think that it would be very much easier to give up the order of the spiritual master and go into a condition of life. The spiritual master may order us to execute one service, but we may have the thought, no, it's very difficult, I can't do it, it disturbs my mind, and give up the order of the spiritual master. But that's a false conception of peace, because this peace is coming and going. This is a peace on the material platform. Real peace is knowing, is taking shelter under the lotus feet of Lord Krishna and escaping the ocean of material existence. Real peace is not just existing on the platform of peace of the body and peace of the mind. There's peace of the soul. Peace in knowing that Ainanda Tanuja Kinkaram Petitamam Vishame Bhavambado Kripaya Padapada Pankaja Stita Duli Sadrisham Vichintaya. That knowing oneself and feeling oneself secure, feeling peaceful with the conception that I am situated as a pure soul at Lord Krishna's lotus feet. By holding on to Lord Krishna's lotus feet very tightly, then comes the real peace. And so similarly, Anandam, real happiness or real bliss, we may be in a very distressful situation, and similarly by executing devotional service, it may look like we're not happy. We may be doing something, and we may be doing some service that we're not very pleased to do. We may be in a situation which we're not very pleased to be in, just like, or so many things are there. Again, taking an example, Srila Prabhupada will order his devotees, his disciples, to execute so many services which are very difficult to do and which seemingly disturb their happiness. It's, again, taking an example of devotees in London. You can't be, it's very difficult to understand. Naturally, we can understand it's not a very pleasant situation to be living on the streets in a foreign country. It's not very pleasant to go to China to preach when you don't know Chinese. There are no contacts there. The Krishna consciousness movement hasn't even taken root there. But the disciples of Srila Prabhupada were doing so upon his order. It's not very pleasant to enter into a Muslim country that's at war with another country and try to preach Krishna consciousness there. But on the order of Srila Prabhupada, his disciples did that. And the result is, you can just see, my own spiritual master, I've recounted this before, he recounts it quite often, His Holiness Bhaktivikas Swami. He says that in preaching Krishna consciousness within, I believe Burma specifically, he said, it was a very difficult time. It was very difficult to preach there. The situation of the temple was very trying, and it was just a big struggle almost every day. But he recalls that he visited Vrindavan. He was in Vrindavan, and one morning, one Mangal Arti, he could then feel the mercy of Krishna flowing through. There was practical perception of how, yes, this is the proper thing to do. I am executing the order of my spiritual master. I'm doing what's required of me, what is desired of me. I'm trying to render my best to service to Lord Krishna, and Krishna is reciprocating exactly that, because Krishna has given his word that what is this verse? Yeta man prapadete tamstataiva bhajamiyaham. That according to how we render service to the Lord, Krishna will respond to that. So if we render service to the Lord with our own personal comfort in mind, holding back and rendering a lower grade of service, or Krishna will respond to that. But if we render very intense, Tivrin Bhakti Yogana, very intense devotional service without care for our own bodily facility, then Krishna will also reciprocate with that, and we'll feel that. And not that a devotee necessarily aspires for it, but this point that a devotee actually tastes this ananda purivardhanam pratipadam purnamrita swadanam. At every step, a pure devotee tastes the nectarian mellows devotional service, and it seems newer and newer and newer. So, I believe that's all the points of this purport. Let me just glance over. So yeah, just one final point. So, Srila Prabhupada sort of just summarizing all of this, he says, one can attain the stage of love of God by pure devotional service, or by a learned labor of love, for the sake of the devotee's lovable object, the personality of Godhead. It's not about how materially expert we may perform something. It's not about how learned we are, how nice we can sing, how expert we are in doing various crafts, how well we can dance, how well we can cook, how many books we can distribute, how well we can dress, etc. It's not about any of these externals. It's simply about a learned labor of love, simply acting for the sake of the devotee's lovable object, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And so the Prabhupada very succinctly summarizes everything. To be more clear, if one wants to attain the stage of love of Godhead, he must give up all desires for material enjoyment. He should refrain from worshiping any of the demigods, and he should devote himself only to the worship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The pure devotee is only favorably engaged in the service of the Lord without any hope of emolument, I suppose, compensation. This will bring about love of Godhead, or the stage of Shantam and Anandam, as stated in this verse. So, we have some minutes left, so I can end my class here. I've kind of breezed over all the points Srila Prabhupada has made, I hope. And I can open up for any comments or questions anybody may have.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Okay. So, there's a comment and a question.
Mm-hmm.
The comment is, I was speaking with Tejas Prabhu yesterday, and any conversation he always has something witty to say. So he was congratulating us, the entire team, for the very successfully executed book distribution marathon for Srila Prabhupada's pleasure. And he was affirming how Srila Prabhupada and Krishna are very, very pleased with this activity, and that we're doing a very good job. And then he said that, and then he asked, what happens if Krishna is pleased? What happens if Krishna is pleased? These kind of questions, he asked these kind of questions, these kind of questions. I said, well, if Krishna is pleased, your material desires reduce, and you attain love of God. He said, yeah, but how is it in the process? He was like, I'm specifically referring to something. I would have never guessed it. But he said that if Krishna gives you an opportunity and you use that opportunity to serve him and you please him, then what does Krishna do? He gives you more opportunities. Mm-hmm. Then he floods you with opportunities. What he does is he floods you with opportunities, and almost like you are gasping. You become completely immersed. And this is how Krishna, reciprocates. Mm-hmm. Krishna's reciprocation is always to increase, and the way he increases is it's just a flood. It's not like a gradual increase of a stream or anything like that. It's just like, it's a downpour that exponentially gets more and more and more. And so he was like, if you already thought that, wow, that was really intense, just get ready for for a whole lot more. You know, and so he was like that. He was laughing, and he was saying that's what was his experience serving in Delhi. You know, you kind of feel like you reached the zenith or something like that. And you're like, oh, come on, okay, so this is like unimaginable, and then it just gets like, you know, way more like intense. Anyways, it's ecstatic. That's the point. Question. You were stating this point about how, you know, a devotee, he's interested in pleasing Krishna. And, you know, if Krishna is pleased by a particular devotee's service, who's very expert in that service, this devotee who has a desire to please Krishna is very happy in just assisting that
other person,
person, or facilitating it in some way, shape, or form. However, you know, when we practice devotional service, especially in our rather beginning years of Krishna consciousness, you know, there's always this search of self-fulfillment, like what is my contribution, what is like my service. And there's the philosophy, you know, you could do, there's all services are equal and we have to be pleased with all the services, but there's always that yearning. And I believe you've experienced that in your life also. So I thought if you could speak a little bit about that, because sometimes it can feel a little contradictory that you understand Krishna is pleased, but then there is some desire within the heart to serve. Or in some cases, you don't even know but you desire to serve in a particular manner that you feel would feel contributed. And sometimes, especially when you're relatively new in Krishna consciousness, you don't even know what that service is. And sometimes that causes a bit of a disturbance in the mind, some discouragement also, because you're not so expert in something. And you know, you can assist someone in being who's expert, but then there's some desire that you know, you understand what I'm trying. So
what am I going to do?
So
something like that.
If you could comment on that.
Yeah, well,
because you've been through it yourself.
Well, I mean, there's different points. One thing is it exactly relates to your comment. As you go on in devotional service and as you improve your devotional service to Krishna, Krishna gives you that service opportunity. He expands those service opportunities. And that is applicable in many regards, but specifically that. It comes through that. It comes through an intense desire. It comes to prayer for Krishna. If you won't, and this idea of hitting on this point of self-satisfaction, that even though that's the highest, we have some sort of sense of self-satisfaction. So we can render, it's not technically pure devotional service in the sense of Uttama Bhakti, the pure sense of devotional service, but it's a motivated form of devotional service. And so we can render service to Lord Krishna with the idea that it could go under so many different headings, but like that's, you know, I would like to do this, I would like to do that, I would like to perform for this service. But, and that's there, and Krishna will reciprocate, Krishna will reciprocate however we approach him. So if somebody, well, I mean, it's up to Krishna, I can't give a guarantee, but generally, if you pray to Krishna and I don't know, whatever you want to do. If you really want to open a restaurant for Krishna and cook for Krishna, you very intensely pray to Krishna, this is what I want to do, but it's more out of a selfish motive that I want to do this service, this is what I want to do. Krishna will reciprocate with that, or he may not. But if he does give you that desire, if he fulfills that desire, that pseudo-devotional desire, his nature is that he'll do it in such a way that you wish you didn't ask for it. So you may get the service, but you may be completely miserable in the service. Because the thing is, it's not about the service. And the highest level is not about the service. As I was saying, it's not about how many books you distribute. It's not about what you do. It's about the fact you're serving Krishna. So you have to look, are you serving Krishna ultimately, or are you serving your own desires? If you're serving your own desires under the pretext of trying to serve Krishna, it doesn't matter what you'll do, you'll never actually attain Shanta, and you will never actually attain Ananda. You'll never be happy, or you won't be peaceful in your life. But your mind will deceive you into thinking such. But if you give up all this idea that, you know, this is what I want to do, I want to do this, I need this, etc., and simply open yourself up to Krishna's service, whatever comes your way, and what's needed specifically, the Krishna will reciprocate with that according to his own desires. He may give you a service you want, he may not give you a service you want. But regardless, for the devotee, it doesn't matter, because the real object of a devotee's attraction, as Srila Prabhupada says in this, the real work for a devotee is only for the sake of the devotee's lovable object, the personality of Godhead. So in terms of practicality, is there. In terms of like a specific service, it comes through maturity in devotional service. Krishna opening up the path effectively, because otherwise we can't even. Our capacity to engage in devotional service entirely depends upon Guru and Krishna. So devotional service and the various varieties of devotional service are revealed and given to us by Guru and Krishna in one form or another. And again, to summarize this other point, that wanting to do our own, or like having our own ideas in devotional service, it won't, at a practical level, we can do it, we can try it. Some people have to try it, just like some people, they have to enter into the Grihastha ashram and experience that it's miserable. We can try it, but the result is there in Shastra. Lord Chaitanya says you're very unintelligent, and he'll give it to you in such a way they will never ask for it again. So, as there. So,
actually, this point about what you said in connection with what Tejas Prabhu says, has been also my experience, is that each living entity, jiva, is actually, we're all endowed with certain levels of expertise to please Krishna, and we have and that is a guarantee, because we have been created for his pleasure. Like that is the very purpose of our existence, is to give him pleasure. So therefore, if we are patient and we abide by Guru and Krishna's orders, then it becomes revealed to us as to Krishna sends that opportunity, because like Tejas Prabhu is saying, he gives the opportunities, and then it's amazing how we somehow settle into this services that we become very satisfied with. And Krishna, and it's the need, and Krishna, and it becomes very blissful. And personally, in every experience in Krishna consciousness is some kind of lesson that Krishna is teaching us. So many lessons to be learned. But anyway, thank you for the comment, realization.
There's one other, let me see if I can find the verse. I was trying to memorize it, but it's okay, here. So Srila Raghunath Das Goswami, he writes this verse, and there's a book called Vilapa Kusumanjali. Part of it's famous, I'm pretty sure we all know part of it. Vairagya Yog Bhakti Rasam Priyatnir Apayayan Mam Anapipsum Antam Krip Ambudhir Yafparadukha Dukhi Snatastam Prabhum Ashrayami. That I was unwilling to drink the nectar of devotional service possessed of renunciation, but Sanatana Goswami, out of his causeless mercy, made me drink it, even though I was otherwise unable to do so. Therefore, he is an ocean of mercy. He is very compassionate to the fallen souls like me, and thus it is my duty to offer my respectful obeisances unto his lotus feet. So sometimes in life, in devotional service, we don't want to do we don't want to do that which is for our own benefit. But if a sadhu is merciful upon us, if we're lucky, they'll force us to do it. And by forcing us to do it, the result is this. And there's, as is said in this verse, it's possessed of renunciation. There has to be some renunciation there. Some renunciation in executing it. And the result is that we actually taste the nectar of devotional service. So anyway, more can be said, but I think that's sufficient. More questions or comments from anybody? Yes.
Prabhu, you were talking about the old days of like Guru Das Prabhu and Shyamasundar Prabhu, and being on the streets in London and stuff like that. I was kind of wondering and reflecting recently of like the modern day Krishna consciousness movement, and how back then the devotees were influencing society in such an impactful way. And I was just kind of reflecting, like, is there scope for that nowadays? Because we're hardly even out there. But back then in the 70s, they were like on the television, they were on the radio, they were on the streets, they were mingling with the public. They had all these big concerts and stuff like that. But we're like way down below. Like, I mean, I just wondering, is there scope for that nowadays to like be
Definitely.
out on the...
There's no loss or diminution in devotional service. It's not that there's that which is manifest and that which is unmanifest. So the glory of the Krishna consciousness movement under Srila Prabhupada's direction, it may appear, it seemed like it was going to take over the world, and it was expanding to such an extent and influencing society. So the Vaibhav, the opulence of the Krishna consciousness movement was being manifest. Now, it may not necessarily be manifest, but it doesn't mean it's not there. It just has to be uncovered by the devotees' devotional service. Just as Vrindavan is always glorious, but through Srila Sanatana Goswami's service, by his excavating all the lost pilgrimage sites of Lord Chaitanya, of Vrindavan, of Lord Krishna, etc., he turned Vrindavan. It was already a tirtha, but you see Vrindavan today. How it's been transformed, whereas previously it was practically nothing during Sanatana Goswami's time. So through the service of a devotee, and again, the same thing, through, if you look at the order of Srila Prabhupada, he says that it's possible. What was possible before is again possible today, because the spiritual master is given the order. So if we stick to Srila Prabhupada's instructions, practically, in terms of like, people knowing devotees, my experience in Atlanta is just like, we've been here, speaking practically, we've just been here a very short amount of time, and already so many people in Atlanta already know us actually. And so many people, they say, particularly when I went to the airport, a lot of people would be like, I haven't seen you guys in years. So just being out there, and there's so much that could be said in this regard, but it just comes down to the point of following the order of the spiritual master very intently. Because Srila Prabhupada has given us so many programs for the execution of Krishna consciousness, which can bring about a revolution in the impious lives of today's men. We can, if we stick to the words of Srila Prabhupada, we can influence both the leaders and the mass of people. And we see, as Prabhupada disciples have noted, we see that the change in the world, that gradually, these things, these sub-religious principles, as Jayadvaita Swami calls them, the things like veganism, nonviolence, these sorts of things are becoming prominent in society only because of the influence of Srila Prabhupada, the distribution of Srila Prabhupada's books. And so it's a fact that it's Srila Prabhupada, he writes in Chaitanya Charitamrita that to paraphrase, it's an inevitability that the whole world will be overflooded by the love of Godhead. It's only a question of time. So if we can bring about it by our own endeavor, if we all come together and try to do so, and it's just the same thing. But whether regardless of our own effort, it's going to happen because it's already been predicted by the Acharyas and Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So it's there. It just takes sincere effort. So is that okay? So anything from the Mataji side? Yes. Yeah.
Hare Krishna.
You have to flip, I think there's a switch on it, which mutes it.
Okay. My question is, if the spiritual boat is never in darkness, how did Krishna have the pastime with the gopis in water lit by moonlight?
How is it lit by moonlight? That's a good question. Well, that's a good question. Well, that's Krishna's arrangement. It's his, we can understand like philosophically, and again, when you get to, so philosophically that's there, it's just like the same as like, everybody's an eternal servant of Krishna, but then Krishna, Mother Yashoda, effectively, if you look at it from a position of rasa and then position of mellows, Mother Yashoda is the boss of Krishna, superficially appearing. So Krishna may present, simply put, as Yogamaya, as a situation which Krishna appears by his spiritual, creates by his spiritual energy to arrange such. He makes arrangements by such a thing. So.
There's no moon, but there's a moon.
Yeah, there's no moon, there's no demigods. I mean, there's nobody higher than Krishna in Golok and Vrindavan, but even in Golok and Vrindavan, you'll find there are devotees who play the position of demigods for the sake of enacting the Leela. So, simply put, for the sake of, even though there's no darkness there, to facilitate Krishna's pastimes, to make them more relishable, Krishna makes darkness. But that darkness is not even, I mean, it's not like the darkness of this material world. It's a different form of darkness. What that darkness is, I don't know, but I know for a fact it's not the same. It's just like spiritual light. There's material light, just like there's light in this room, but the light that is coming from Krishna's body, the light of the spiritual world, is completely different. They're both light, so similarly to material darkness and spiritual darkness, two completely different things. So, is that okay? All right. Are there more questions from the Mataji side?
Hare Krishna.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Mine might be a little too long for time, but I can mention it, and then if
We can allow like a little extra time since.
Well, Vishnu Chitta Prabhu was speaking on, like, when Krishna is pleased with our service, then he'll flood you with more services.
Mhm.
But I guess my question would be, when you're flooded with those services, and each, those opportunities are all of service to Krishna, how are you able to check whether it's, the service that Krishna wants you to do versus your own, your own
Your own, like,
desires?
is there more, or is that?
No,
Okay,
that's it.
well, it's your own intelligent discrimination, and self-introspective, self-introspecting, seeing, is it like, am I executing this service because I want to do it, or am I executing this service because I would just simply out of a devotional feeling, a real devotional capacity. And also, it's there are different factors. It could have been what you could see generally, what the spiritual master, the order of the spiritual master, the mood of the spiritual master, and particularly of the need. So in the beginning, we may even execute, if we may be given some service to do, and we may want to do that service just by chance. Krishna may arrange such a situation like that. But inevitably, there comes a time where somebody asks us to do that service, and we don't want to do that service. Just like sometimes we want to cook for Krishna, but then sometimes there's nobody to cook, and you have to cook at like 4 o'clock in the morning, among other things. So my point is that, so Krishna may give you that service which you may desire, but if he's merciful upon you, even if you can't clearly distinguish whether or not you have mixed motives, Krishna's nature is such that he purifies, he's within our heart, and his goal is to purify us. So he'll present the situations regarding that service for our purification, just like this, to make sure that we're executing that service, not because of any sort of personal motive or personal sense gratification, but simply for the sake of pleasing Krishna with that service, if that makes sense. Is that clear? Okay. All right. Anything else from the Mataji side? Okay, so we can end there. Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Vancha Kapatubhyascha Kripa Sundabhya Vachapatita Nam Bhavane Vyo Vaishnava Vyo Namo Namaha.
Sadhu, sadhu.